The wheels of Frank's SUV crunched over gravel as they made their way up the winding mountain path. His wife Chloe sat beside him, while their daughter Tessa dozed in the back seat, their cat Shadow curled up in his carrier beside her. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pine trees, creating an ethereal atmosphere that made Frank grip the steering wheel a bit tighter. "Are you sure about this place?" Chloe asked, studying the increasingly remote surroundings. "It seems rather isolated." Frank forced a smile. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Getting away from everything." But even as he said it, he felt a twinge of uncertainty. The rental listing had advertised the chalet as secluded and peaceful, but as they climbed higher into the mountains, those words took on a different meaning. Shadow, usually calm during car rides, began to growl softly from his carrier. It was an unusual sound that made Tessa stir from her sleep. "What's wrong with him?" she asked, reaching to comfort the cat through the carrier's bars. "I've never heard him make that noise before." Frank glanced in the rearview mirror at their black cat, whose yellow eyes were fixed intently on something through the window. "Probably just anxious from the long drive," he said, though he'd never known Shadow to be anxious about anything in all the years they'd had him. The chalet finally came into view around a sharp bend, an imposing structure of dark wood and stone that seemed to grow right out of the mountainside. As Frank parked, fat drops of rain began to fall from the rapidly darkening sky. "Perfect timing," he said, trying to sound cheerful as they rushed to unload their bags. But the sound of distant thunder made him frown. The forecast hadn't mentioned any storms. Inside out, the chalet was everything the listing had promised, rustic yet comfortable, with a huge stone fireplace and windows that offered spectacular views of the valley below. But as they settled in, Shadow's strange behavior continued. The normally laid-back cat paced restlessly, his tail puffed up, stopping occasionally to stare intently at the walls or ceiling. "Maybe he senses mice," Chloe suggested, but her voice held a note of uncertainty. They'd never seen their cat act this way before. The storm hit in full force as night fell. Wind howled around the chalet's eaves, and rain lashed against the windows with frightening intensity. Frank tried the TV, but the satellite signal was already out. Their cell phones showed no service, not unusual for such a remote location, but somehow more unsettling now. Shadow suddenly stopped his pacing and sat perfectly still in the center of the living room, staring fixedly at the front door. A low growl emerged from deep in his throat, the same unusual sound they'd heard in the car. The family watched, transfixed, as their typically gentle pet's behavior grew increasingly bizarre. Then came the sound they'd been dreading, the rumble of moving earth. Frank ran to the window just in time to see the access road disappear under a torrent of mud and debris. "Dad?" Tessa's voice quavered. "What's happening?" Before Frank could answer, Shadow let out a yowl unlike anything they'd ever heard, a sound of pure animal terror. The cat bolted upstairs, still crying out in that unnatural way. The family stood frozen, looking at each other in growing alarm. They were now completely cut off from the outside world, and their beloved pet was acting as though he sensed something they couldn't perceive, something that filled him with absolute dread. Thunder crashed overhead, and in the brief silence that followed, they heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a sound that made Shadow's strange behavior suddenly seem like a warning. Something was moving in the walls of the chalet, and whatever it was getting closer. Frank moved cautiously toward the wall where the sound had originated, flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. The power had begun to flicker, casting uncertain shadows across the chalet's interior. Behind him, Chloe held Tessa close, both of them watching with wide eyes as he pressed his ear against the wooden paneling. The scratching sound came again, more distinct now, a dry, rustling movement that seemed to travel upward through the wall's interior. Frank's mind raced through possibilities: mice, squirrels, maybe even raccoons that had found their way into the chalet's structure to escape the storm. But something about the sound's pattern felt wrong, too deliberate, too purposeful. "Maybe we should try to find Shadow," Tessa whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm's fury. The cat's earlier display had left them all shaken, and his continued absence was unsettling. They'd never seen him hide for so long before. Frank nodded, grateful for any excuse to step away from that wall and its disturbing sounds. Good idea, sweetheart. Let's all go together. He didn't want anyone separated right now, not with the road blocked and communications down. They climbed the stairs slowly, calling Shadow's name in gentle voices. The upper floor was darker, the windows offering little light through the storm's gloom. Frank's flashlight beam revealed closed doors leading to bedrooms, and what looked like a study at the end of the hall. A low growl emanated from behind one of the doors, that same strange sound they'd heard in the car, but deeper now, more urgent. Frank pushed the door open carefully to find Shadow crouched in the corner of what appeared to be a child's bedroom. Old toys lay scattered about, covered in dust, as if the room's previous occupant had left in a hurry and never returned. The cat's eyes were fixed on the ceiling, his entire body rigid with tension. As they watched, he slowly backed further into the corner, never taking his gaze from whatever he seemed to be tracking above them. Frank. Chloe's voice was tight with fear. Look at the wallpaper. He raised the flashlight, and they all saw it, a long vertical crack in the wallpaper that hadn't been there when they first opened the door. As they stared, the crack widened slightly, accompanied by that same dry, rustling sound they'd heard downstairs. Shadow let out another of those terrible yowls and bolted past them, nearly tripping Frank as the cat fled down the hallway, but they barely noticed, transfixed by what was emerging from behind the wallpaper. Papers, dozens of them, yellowed with age, pushing their way through the widening crack like pale, brittle leaves. Frank reached out with trembling fingers and carefully extracted one of the sheets. It was a letter, the handwriting cramped and desperate. My dearest Elizabeth, they're watching the house now. I don't dare leave to mail this letter. The evidence is hidden where they'll never think to look, in the walls themselves. If anything happens to me, you must tell them about... The letter ended there, torn off mid-sentence. Frank pulled out more papers, revealing fragments of what appeared to be financial documents, photographs, and more letters, all of them decades old based on their appearance. Dad? Tessa's voice quavered. Why would someone hide papers in the walls? Before Frank could answer, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the chalet, and the power failed completely. In the sudden darkness, illuminated only by Frank's flashlight, they heard new sounds beginning, not just in the walls now, but in the floors and ceiling too. It was as if the entire structure had come alive, filled with movement they couldn't see. Shadow's cries echoed from somewhere below. Followed by the distinct sound of breaking glass, they hurried downstairs to find one of the large windows had shattered, letting in the storm's fury. Rain and wind whipped through the room, scattering papers everywhere, more documents, falling like snow from somewhere above them. Frank struggled to close the heavy wooden shutters over the broken window, while Chloe and Tessa gathered the scattered papers. The beam of the flashlight revealed more fragments of a story they were only beginning to understand. Reports of missing funds, threatening letters, and photographs of people whose faces had been carefully crossed out. Frank, look at this, Chloe called, her voice strange. She held up a photograph that made his blood run cold. It showed the chalet, taken many years ago judging by the image quality, but it was the group of people standing in front that caught his attention. Because there, at the edge of the group, was someone he recognized, someone who couldn't possibly have been there. Shadow suddenly appeared beside them, pressing against their legs with his fur still bristling. But his behavior had changed. Instead of fear, he now showed focused intensity, as if he had a purpose. The cat padded across the room to a specific section of wall and began to paw at it insistently. Frank followed, running his hands over the wooden panels until he felt it. A slight seam, nearly invisible in the dim light. With trembling fingers, he pressed against it, and a small section of the wall swung open with a creak of aged hinges. The hidden compartment wasn't large, barely bigger than a shoebox, but what they found inside made them all gasp. A leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, and alongside it, something that glinted dully in the flashlight beam, a key, ancient and ornate, attached to a faded ribbon. As Frank reached for the journal, Shadow suddenly went rigid again, his eyes fixed on something behind them. They turned slowly, following the cat's gaze, and there in the darkness of the hallway They saw what their pet had been sensing all along. The shadow cast by Frank's flashlight showed a figure that shouldn't have been possible, because it wasn't their shadow being cast, and it was moving on its own. The storm raged harder, and in that moment, they realized that Shadow hadn't been warning them about something in the chalet. He'd been trying to tell them about something that had been trapped here, something that had been waiting for someone to uncover the truth hidden in these walls. And now that they had found it, they would have to decide what to do with the dark secret this isolated chalet had been keeping for so many years. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving them frozen in place, hearts pounding. Shadow the cat had positioned himself between the family and where the figure had been, his tail slowly swishing back and forth, alert but no longer showing signs of fear. Frank's hands trembled as he opened the leather journal, its pages crackling with age. Chloe held the flashlight steady while Tessa pressed close, Shadow remaining vigilant at their feet. The handwriting matched the letter they'd found in the walls, cramped, urgent strokes that spoke of desperation. "Property records," Frank muttered, scanning the first pages. "Bank statements, transaction logs." His voice trailed off as he turned another page. "This is all evidence of fraud. Massive fraud." Chloe leaned in closer, her breath catching as she read over his shoulder. "These records show money being siphoned from a major bank. The person who wrote this, they were collecting proof." Frank flipped through more pages until he reached a handwritten entry that made him stop. "I can no longer pretend ignorance of what's happening at the bank. The missing funds, the forged documents. It all leads back to him, my own brother-in-law, using his position to steal from thousands of people. I've gathered enough evidence to expose everything, but he knows I'm onto him. Elizabeth thinks I'm paranoid, but I've seen his men watching our house. Tonight, I'm taking these records to our vacation chalet. It's the only place I can think of where they won't look." The entry ended there, but a newspaper clipping fell from between the pages. The headline read, "Local bank executive found dead in apparent hiking accident." The date on the newspaper was decades old, but the face in the photograph, it was the same person they'd recognized in the old photo of the chalet. Thunder crashed outside as another gust of wind sent more papers swirling around the room. Shadow suddenly perked up, his attention drawn to something near the fireplace. The cat padded over and began pawing at the stone hearth. Frank followed, running his hands along the rough stone until he felt it. Another seam, similar to the one in the wall. The key they'd found fit perfectly into a nearly invisible keyhole. With a grinding sound, a section of the hearth swung open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside lay a metal strongbox, its surface corroded with age. The key opened this too, and within they found more documents, but these were different. Bank records showing where the stolen money had really gone, photographs proving the accident had been anything but, and letters revealing a conspiracy that had ended in murder. "Frank," Chloe whispered, "we need to get these to the authorities. This is evidence of serious crimes." "But how?" Tessa asked. "We're trapped here, remember? The road is gone." As if in response to her words, they heard a new sound over the storm, the distant whump-whump of helicopter blades. Shadow ran to the window, no longer showing any signs of distress. Frank's phone suddenly chirped, the first signal they'd had since arriving. A text message appeared. "Saw the landslide. Rescue team en route to your location. Hang tight." They looked at each other, relief flooding through them. But their relief was short-lived as Shadow suddenly growled again, that same warning sound from before. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and they all felt it, a presence behind them, different from the shadow they'd seen earlier. They turned to find an elderly woman standing in the doorway, as solid-looking as any living person despite the impossibility of her presence. She smiled gently, her eyes fixed on the documents in their hands. "You found them," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the storm's rage. "I've waited so long for someone to find them." "Elizabeth?" Frank asked, remembering the name from the letters. She nodded. "My husband tried to do the right thing, and they killed him for it. They buried the truth along with his body, and I've spent decades watching, waiting for someone to uncover what really happened." Shadow approached the woman, rubbing against her legs as if she was solid flesh and blood. She reached down to stroke his fur, her hand passing through him yet somehow still causing his fur to ruffle. "Cats have always known when I'm present," she said. "Your shadow here. He's been trying to help you understand since you arrived. The storm wasn't an accident. I've learned to influence small things, you see. I needed someone to be trapped here long enough to find the truth." The helicopter sounds grew louder as Elizabeth's form began to fade. "The evidence is in your hands now. Please, make sure they finally face justice for what they did." She disappeared completely, just as bright searchlights swept across the chalet's windows. Shadow sat calmly, purring, all signs of his earlier distress gone. The cat had known all along, not just about Elizabeth's presence, but about the importance of what lay hidden in the chalet's walls. As rescue workers began pounding on the front door, Frank clutched the documents tightly. They had stumbled upon something far bigger than a simple getaway weekend, and now they had a responsibility to right a long-buried wrong. The storm was beginning to ease, but their journey was far from over. The truth had waited decades to be discovered. Now it was finally time for it to be told. But even as help arrived and their immediate ordeal came to an end, they all knew that Shadow's strange behavior had been more than just animal instinct. Their cat had somehow known, had sensed both the danger and the importance of what was hidden in this isolated chalet. He had guided them, protected them, and ultimately helped them uncover a truth that had been waiting years to be found. As they prepared to leave with the rescue team, Shadow gave one final look around the chalet, as if saying goodbye to Elizabeth. They all understood now that some mysteries go beyond rational explanation, and that sometimes it takes a cat's peculiar wisdom to help humans find their way to the truth. The helicopter's spotlight illuminated their path as they carefully made their way out of the chalet, Shadow leading the way with his tail held high, proud of the role he had played in uncovering a long-buried secret. The documents they carried would finally bring justice to those who had waited so long for the truth to emerge from the shadows of the past. The rescue helicopter delivered them to a small mountain town where they found temporary shelter in a local inn. Shadow curled contentedly on Tessa's bed, while Frank spread the discovered documents across a wooden table, carefully organizing decades of secrets. "Look at this," Chloe said, holding up a faded photograph. It showed the bank's board of directors, including Elizabeth's husband and his brother-in-law. The latter's face bore a striking resemblance to the current bank president, his son, who had inherited both his father's position and his secrets. Frank's hands trembled as he dialed the number for law enforcement. The evidence was irrefutable, not just of the original crime, but of its continued cover-up. The stolen money had been carefully hidden, passed down through generations, while families of the original victims had struggled for decades. Shadow suddenly leaped from the bed and pressed against the window, his tail twitching. Outside, an expensive black car crawled past the inn, its tinted windows concealing its occupants. The cat's low growl reminded them all too much of their time in the chalet. "They know," Tessa whispered, pulling Shadow away from the window. "Somehow, they know we found something." Frank made the call. Within hours, federal agents arrived at the inn, their presence drawing curious looks from locals. As Frank handed over the documents, Shadow watched intently, as if ensuring the evidence reached the right hands. But their ordeal wasn't over. That night, Shadow's behavior changed again. The cat paced restlessly between their rooms, refusing to settle. His anxiety proved prophetic when they heard footsteps in the hallway, too many for the late hour, too purposeful to be innocent. Chloe quickly gathered their belongings, while Frank called the federal agents who had taken their statement. Shadow led them to a service stairwell just as their room door burst open. They descended into the kitchen, the cat moving with surprising stealth for his size. Through the kitchen's back door, they emerged into the cold mountain air. Shadow darted ahead, guiding them through dark alleys as voices shouted behind them. The cat's night vision proved invaluable as they navigated the unfamiliar town. They found refuge in an all-night diner, where a sympathetic waitress recognized their distress and hid them in the storage room. Shadow kept watch at the door while they waited for help to arrive. "Your cat," the waitress whispered when she brought them coffee. "He reminds me of stories my grandmother used to tell, about animals who could sense things beyond our understanding." Who could see both the physical world and what lies behind it? Through the diner's windows, they watched federal agents arrest several men who had been searching the town, including the bank president's head of security. The family's evidence had opened a decades-old wound, and the truth was finally bleeding out. But Shadow remained alert, and they soon understood why. The newspaper headlines the next morning revealed that the bank president had disappeared, taking with him millions in assets. The cat's strange behavior in the chalet had been more than a warning about hidden documents. He had sensed the echoes of past crimes reaching into the present. Elizabeth's gentle spirit had helped them uncover the truth. But Shadow's instincts told them their part in this story wasn't finished. The cat led them back to their room at the inn, where he pawed insistently at Frank's laptop bag. Inside, they found one last document they hadn't noticed before, a list of properties owned by the bank president's family, including several remote locations where a fugitive might hide. Elizabeth's final gift to them was the means to finish what her husband had started. As federal agents planned their search, Shadow sat in the window, watching the mountain road that led back to the chalet. His tail twitched with that same knowing intensity they'd first seen during the storm. The cat's behavior had changed them all, made them question what they thought they knew about the world and the invisible threads that connected past and present. The truth about the bank fraud was spreading rapidly through the town. Elderly residents came forward with stories about loved ones who had lost everything decades ago. Young people discovered that their families' hardships had roots in events they'd never known about. The ripples of justice, long delayed, were finally spreading. But Shadow's continued vigilance suggested that danger still lurked. The cat's extraordinary senses had already proven more reliable than any human intuition. When he suddenly leapt down from the windowsill and padded to the door, they knew to pay attention. A note had been slipped under their door, not a threat, but a message from someone claiming to have worked at the bank for years, someone who wanted to share more information about where the missing president might be hiding. Shadow sniffed the note and gave a soft meow, not his warning sound, but something more encouraging. The cat that had led them to uncover decades of deception was now telling them there was more to discover. Frank looked at his family, seeing in their faces the same determination he felt. They had started this journey by chance, guided by a cat's mysterious instincts and a ghost's need for justice. Now they had to see it through to the end. "What do you think, Shadow?" Frank asked, watching as their cat sat regally beside the note. "Ready to help us solve one more mystery?" Shadow's purr rumbled through the room like distant thunder, reminiscent of the storm that had started it all. Outside, the mountain peaks loomed against the darkening sky, holding who knew how many more secrets in their remote valleys and hidden places. But this time, they weren't afraid. They had learned to trust Shadow's instincts, to believe in things that went beyond ordinary explanation. Whatever came next, they would face it together. A family and their remarkable cat, who had proven that sometimes the greatest truths come to light through the most unexpected guides. The agents were mobilizing, following leads to every possible hiding place. But Shadow's behavior suggested he already knew something they didn't. The cat that had sensed Elizabeth's presence, that had led them to the hidden documents, was now leading them toward the final chapter of this decades-old mystery, and this time they were ready to follow wherever he led them. The anonymous note led them to a retired bank employee who lived on the outskirts of town. Shadow sat calmly in the car as they drove, but his ears twitched with interest when they pulled up to the modest house. The elderly man who answered the door introduced himself as Henry, a former security guard who had worked at the bank during the original investigation. His hands shook as he invited them inside, Shadow trailing behind them like a silent guardian. "I've carried this secret for too long," Henry said, retrieving a dusty box from his closet. "The night Elizabeth's husband died, I was on duty. What I saw—" He paused, watching as Shadow approached the box with obvious interest. Inside were security logs that had never been submitted to investigators, photographs that showed suspicious figures entering the bank after hours, and most importantly, a detailed record of underground vault access that proved the current bank president had been moving assets long before his father's death. "But there's more," Henry said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The president has a personal vault in the old mining tunnels. His family bought the land years ago, converted part of it into a secure storage facility. That's where he'll be. Shadow's ears perked up at this information, and he moved to the window, staring intently at the mountains looming in the distance. The cat's behavior had become their most reliable compass through this mystery. Federal agents quickly mobilized based on Henry's information, but the mining tunnel complex was vast, with countless branching passages. As they studied the old mining maps, Shadow suddenly jumped onto the table, his paw landing precisely on a section of tunnel marked as collapsed. "He's done this before," Frank said quietly. "At the chalet. He knew exactly where to look." The agents were skeptical, but after everything that had happened, Frank's family knew better than to ignore Shadow's insights. They convinced the team to focus their search on that section of the tunnels. The entrance they found had been carefully concealed, but showed recent signs of use. Shadow led the way, his black fur making him nearly invisible in the dim tunnel lighting. The cat moved with purpose, as if following a trail only he could sense. Deeper in the tunnel complex, they began to hear voices echoing off the rock walls. Shadow crouched low, creeping forward with predatory stealth. The agents followed his lead, and soon they could make out words. The bank president was indeed there, arguing with someone about moving the remaining assets. What happened next unfolded like a scene from a movie. The agents moved in, but the president had one last surprise, a hidden exit route. He might have escaped, if not for Shadow. The cat suddenly bolted down a side passage, yowling at full volume. His cries echoed through the tunnels, disorienting the fleeing president and allowing the agents to cut off his escape. As they led the president away in handcuffs, he stared at Shadow with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "That cat," he muttered. "It's like it knew, like it could see." The agents found the hidden vault exactly where Henry's documents had indicated. Inside was not just money, but evidence dating back decades, proof of not just the original crime, but years of systematic theft and fraud that had affected thousands of families. Back at their in-room that night, Shadow sat in the window again, but his posture was different now, relaxed, satisfied. The cat had helped bring a long-hidden truth to light, had helped deliver justice that was decades overdue. A soft knock at their door revealed a group of elderly townspeople. They had come to share their stories, tales of parents and grandparents who had lost everything in the original bank fraud, whose lives had been forever altered by the greed of one family. "We never thought we'd see justice," one woman said, tears in her eyes. "How can we ever thank you?" Shadow padded over to the group, accepting their gentle pats with regal dignity. The cat seemed to understand the magnitude of what had been accomplished, the weight of truth finally brought to light. That night, as the family prepared for bed, they saw one last extraordinary thing. A gentle glow appeared in the corner of the room, coalescing into Elizabeth's form. She smiled at them, then at Shadow, who purred loudly in response. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice filled with peace, "for finishing what my husband started, for bringing the truth into the light." She faded away for the last time, but Shadow showed no distress. Instead, the cat settled onto Tessa's bed with a contented sigh. As if knowing his extraordinary work was complete, the next morning, the town was abuzz with news of the bank president's arrest and the recovered evidence. Families gathered at the local diner, sharing stories and tears of relief. Shadow sat in the window, watching it all with those knowing yellow eyes. The federal investigation would continue for months, unraveling decades of financial crimes. But the heart of the mystery had been solved, thanks to a storm that trapped them in a chalet, a ghost who needed justice, and most importantly, a cat whose mysterious senses had guided them to the truth. As they packed to leave the mountain town, Shadow took one last look at the distant peaks. The cat had shown them that there are forces in the world beyond human understanding, that sometimes the truth needs more than human eyes to be discovered. They had come to the mountains for a simple vacation and found themselves part of something far larger, a story of justice, long delayed but finally served, guided by the extraordinary instincts of their beloved pet. Shadow jumped into the car without hesitation, ready to return to their normal lives, but they all knew their family had been changed by this experience. They had learned to trust in things they couldn't explain, to believe that sometimes the truth comes to light in the most unexpected ways. And Shadow, the cat, simply purred, content in the knowledge that some mysteries are meant to be solved, even if it takes a special kind of wisdom, the kind that only a cat can provide, to uncover them. Part 6. Justice Served. The weeks following the bank president's arrest brought profound changes to the mountain town. Investigators discovered that the stolen money had been invested in properties throughout the region, including several historic buildings in town. As assets were seized and liquidated, plans were made to compensate the families affected by decades of fraud. Shadow's role in uncovering the truth became something of a local legend. The waitress at the diner started keeping premium cat treats behind the counter, and children would wave whenever they saw the black cat in the window of their inn-room. But Shadow remained unchanged by the attention, focused instead on his family and their continued safety. Late one evening, as Frank sorted through thank-you letters from townsfolk, Shadow suddenly leapt onto the desk, scattering papers. The cat pawed at a particular envelope they had overlooked. Inside was a letter from Henry, the former security guard, with one final revelation. "There's a hidden safe in the bank president's office," Henry wrote, "behind a painting of his father. The combination should be in those documents you found. What's inside could help even more families." Shadow's behavior confirmed the letter's importance. The cat paced anxiously until Frank contacted the federal agents. When they opened the safe the next day, they found records of even more victims, families whose losses had never been officially documented. The discovery led to additional compensation claims, bringing closure to dozens more families who had suffered silently for years. Shadow watched from the bank's lobby as elderly residents emerged with tears of joy, finally seeing justice served after so many years. Part 7. The Final Mystery. As their time in the mountain town drew to a close, the family decided to visit the chalet one last time. The road had been repaired, and the autumn weather was perfect for the drive up the mountain. Shadow sat calmly in his carrier, showing none of the anxiety from their first visit. The chalet stood peaceful in the afternoon sun, its dark secrets finally brought to light. Inside, the walls no longer held their hidden burden. But Shadow led them to one last discovery, a loose floorboard in the study that concealed a small box. Inside was a letter from Elizabeth to her husband, never delivered, expressing her regret at not believing his suspicions sooner. Along with it was a family photograph showing them in happier times, before greed and deception tore their world apart. As Frank read the letter aloud, a familiar, peaceful presence filled the room. Elizabeth appeared one final time, more vibrant than ever, smiling at them with pure joy. Shadow approached her, tail held high, accepting her ethereal touch as she knelt beside him. "You were right about this remarkable cat," she said softly. "How some animals can see what we cannot, not just spirits, but the truth in people's hearts. Shadow knew that your family had the courage and compassion to help right these wrongs." She turned to Frank, Chloe, and Tessa. "The truth isn't just about justice, it's about healing, about letting go of the past so that future generations can live without its shadow. You've given this town back its future." Elizabeth's form began to fade, but her smile remained. "Take care of each other," she said, "and thank you, Shadow, for being such a faithful guide." With that, she was gone, but the room remained filled with a profound sense of peace. Shadow settled contentedly in a patch of sunlight, purring as if to say his extraordinary work was truly finished. The family donated the letter and photograph to the town's historical society, where they became part of an exhibition about the bank fraud case and its resolution. Shadow's photo hung alongside them, the cat who helped uncover the truth. As they drove home, leaving the mountains behind, they reflected on how a simple vacation had turned into something so momentous. Their lives had been changed, not just by the mystery they helped solve, but by the realization that truth and justice sometimes arrive through unexpected channels. Shadow slept peacefully in his carrier, once again just their beloved family cat. But they knew he would always be more than that. He had shown them that some mysteries require more than human understanding to solve, that sometimes the truth needs a special kind of wisdom to come to light. The mountain town began to heal, its long-buried wounds finally exposed to the sun. families reconnected, sharing stories of resilience and survival. The bank was reformed under new leadership, committed to transparency and community service. And in a small suburban house, a black cat named Shadow watches from his favorite windowsill. Yellow eyes bright with contentment. He knows what his family now understands, that there are more mysteries in the world than humans can explain, and sometimes it takes a cat's extraordinary instincts to guide them to the truth. In the end, it wasn't just about solving a decades-old crime. It was about the bonds between humans and animals, the connection between past and present, and the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. Shadow had led them to something far more precious than hidden documents or stolen money. He had led them to understanding that justice, like love, sometimes comes in mysterious ways. The family keeps the newspaper clipping about the case framed on their wall, and sometimes, on quiet nights, when Shadow sits in the moonlight with that knowing look in his eyes, they remember the extraordinary adventure that began with a storm, a chalet, and a cat who could sense things beyond human understanding. They know now that some mysteries are meant to be solved, even if it takes a special kind of guide to lead the way. And Shadow, curled up contentedly in his favorite spot, continues to watch over his family, an ordinary cat who, for one extraordinary moment, helped bring truth and justice to light. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.